Shure has been making headphones for a really long time, but audio has been changing. Have they kept up? Hi, I'm DMS, you're watching the Headphone Show, and today we're talking about the Shure SRH440A and 840A. They're $100 and $150 professional headphone offerings. Now, if you've seen our videos about the AKG K371 or K361, well, you'll see there's a lot of people saying, well, hey, why not just get the 440A or the 840A? They're the same price. Shure's been around for a long time, and these do have a reputation in studios. But are they worthy of that reputation? Well, today we're going to dive into these headphones, starting off with build and comfort. And it is certainly not the strongest point talking about build for this headphone. They are pretty... The adjustment mechanism on the side is labeled on the inside. It's nice to have numbers knowing exactly where you're set to, so that way if you want, you can always reset them back to the same position. They do fold and lay flat. They have plenty of different angles for tilt and adjustment, and with all that together, they're actually a pretty comfortable headphone, despite the fact that I do find the pads to be a bit shallow. And not only that, but also a bit plasticky feeling. I think these headphones are definitely comfortable enough for monitoring use. If you're doing a podcast or just need someone to be able to monitor themselves while recording, well, yeah, I think this gets the job done, and isolation is pretty good on top of that. I know I myself can wear them for a considerable number of hours before I have to take them off. And while they may not feel that durable, well, Shure has been making these for a long time and they don't seem to have big problems with quality control. So aside from them feeling very cheap, I don't have too many complaints. I wish the pads were a little bit nicer, and I also wish that the insert on the side for the cable was not a twist lock, as I feel like it defeats the purpose of a quick release cable. If you get your leg caught on these, it is going to pull the headphone off the table. The cable itself is extremely standard, nothing special about it. It's just a long headphone cable with a screw-on 6.3mm adapter. And honestly, the 840A isn't really any different. The only difference in build between these two that I can discern is some coloration. Instead of silver and black, we have gold and black. With a little bit of an added accent here on the stitching, this ring, and the screws. On the outside anyway. On the inside of the pads, there is actually an extra layer of padding, and I do find that it helps during a long listening session. When I have these on my head after a while, my ear does start to touch the plastic on the inside, and on the 840A, I don't feel that due to this extra layer of padding. Around the 3-hour mark, it didn't bother me on the 440A, plus the 3-hour mark, the 840A is definitely more comfortable in this regard. Neither has a considerable thermal buildup on my head. They do a decent enough job of dissipating heat despite being relatively isolating. Though of course, everyone is built differently, your mileage may vary. I also didn't find it too difficult to get a seal on my head, but if you're wearing something like a ball cap, well, you're gonna have problems, and that's going to affect the sound. Speaking of sound, let's get into that, starting with subjective sound, and then we'll talk about frequency response. Subjectively, I kinda hated these headphones when I first put them on, and I still really don't like the $99 SRH440A. If you were to tell me this is the same price as the K361, I would laugh. For monitoring, I guess it doesn't matter that much. If you just need to throw a headphone on someone so they can hear themselves, if you're doing a podcast and all you need is to be able to hear your microphone, okay, sure. Oh, sure. It'll get the job done. But nothing about this headphone is particularly impressive to me. The 440A is boomy, it's bloated, the mid-range suffers through its bass, and the treble is both grainy and it feels like it's lacking a hole somewhere. But at the same time, it's still bright. This leads to kind of a mess of unpleasantness, all factors I really don't like in a headphone. The 840A, on the other hand, at $150, while not perfect, I do find to be considerably better than the 440A. Though the 840A is definitely V-shaped, there is a significant boost to sub-bass, and there's definitely a boost to the high treble. It's very airy. We kind of miss out on some of the mid-range as a result of that. I mean, the mid-range is definitely there, but it is overshadowed by the bass and treble. The result is something that is fun. The result is something that is very punchy, but also confusing for something marketed as a professional headphone. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like this more than something like the M50X, but not as much as something like the AKG K371. There are areas where I feel like this might have an advantage, but it's going to be very, very case specific. For example, if you really didn't like the scoop that the K371 had in part of the treble, maybe you like a more airy sound, or you want something with more padding on top. All that said, it's not nearly as bloated and boomy sounding as the 440A, despite, which you'll see in a while, the lows measure relatively similar. It still definitely has some of a boomy trait to it, and this does bloom a little bit into the mid-range, maybe more than a little bit. But I actually think that the tonality of this overall is something that bass heads might really like. There are some very bass-heavy tracks that I listened to that sounded pretty great on the 840A, and there are some treble-focused tracks that didn't sound sibilant. This is definitely still a brighter headphone on top by a considerable bit. We're not talking like DT990 levels of pain, but it gets up there. Luckily, it's not very grainy, so it does a decent job of making that brighter sound relatively smooth. But if you're treble sensitive, this is not going to be the way to go. Now, I can see benefits of extra treble in a professional setting. It is extremely useful if you are doing recordings to be able to hear if there is hiss in that recording. If you're in a noisy environment, being able to hear the extra bits in the treble, that extra air, can really help you find things that you may not have noticed otherwise. And especially having a boost in the bass and treble can help if you're trying to make sure you don't get things like 60 cycle hum. But I would not mix on these. I would not mix on them at all. And I definitely wouldn't use them as any sort of reference point. Soundstage is very unexceptional. It's pretty much entirely what you would expect from a headphone of this build, and pretty much the same soundstage you could expect from any old consumer headphone in this price point. Not really any soundstage. Imaging is about the same. It's okay with binaural recordings, but it definitely didn't impress me, and I highly doubt it would impress any of you either. As far as detail is concerned, this does have boosted treble, which I feel like can definitely also boost the perception of detail. And since it's not a very grainy headphone, I am inclined to say that it is reasonably detailed at the price, at least when compared to other closebacks. But the transgressions in tuning do make it very hard for me to recommend it over the competition. I mean, at this price, we have both the Rode NTH100 and the AKG K371. Both of those headphones are built better than this, with the exception of this padding on top. And both of those headphones are objectively better than this. But music isn't always about being objective, and you might just want a V-shaped sound in a headphone that's not very grainy. And that is the 840A. I'm sure you can tell this is a very confusing review from me because I both like some aspects of this headphone. I could see why some people would like it, but I also really don't like it. Vocal timbre also suffers. In fact, timbre across the board does. It's much better on the 840A than on the 440A, but the timbre of the 840A, things can either sound a bit too boomy or they can sound too thin. And it kind of goes back and forth. Things like piano don't play very well, things that rely heavily on the mid-range. But if you put on something that plays well to its strengths, well, deep bass and articulated treble, it does pretty decent. And there are some things in classical that sound pretty good on this too, but it's really, really, really mix dependent, and I think this is probably more praise to the mixes than it is to the headphone itself. Which I should clarify, this is not a bad headphone overall, but a V-shaped sound signature is definitely not for me, and I don't see a V-shaped sound signature being great for professionals either. So with all that said, let's talk about objective sound and frequency response. Okay, now we're looking at the Shure SRH440A in red, overlaid with the classic HD6XX. These are both raw measurements, and I find that most people have heard the 6XX, so it's a decent reference point. You can definitely see where the bass is coming from here, and you can definitely see why it sounds a bit bloated as well on the 440A. It does do a decent job of sub-bass extension, but it just extends a bit too far into the mid-range as well. If this shelf started, say, maybe 100 hertz lower than it did right here, it'd be pretty great. But that is just too much bass in the mid-range for me. You start to see pretty decent ear gain, up around 1-2 kilohertz, and then it doesn't really hold up at 3. So we end up with this bit of a recess compared to things like the 6XX, and then the treble goes way up, and we end up with a peak. But that is nowhere near as much treble as we see on the 840A. Here's the 840A. Now, this has, as you can see, a similar amount of bass to the 440A. In fact, I'm gonna show them side by side real quick. They don't look all too different initially, but what we get is a little bit more mid-range and definitely more treble. And with the combination of more mid-range and more treble, well, you don't hear the bloated bass quite as much. It definitely still sounds bassy, but not quite as boomy. The big standouts for me are that we have less of a dip at 300 hertz, a bit more mid-range at 400 hertz, and then around 8K we have a lot more treble. But on top of that, we don't have the recesses from 3K on either. Despite its brightness and despite its bass, this does make the 840A sound more balanced than the 440A, and I think the price reflects accordingly. Between the two, the 840A is just a better sounding headphone, and as bright as it is, So where do I stand on these? I've said a lot of negative things about the 440A and the 840A. Well, if sound is a priority, I don't really see these as the main headphones professionals should be buying. I think if comfort and just having a monitor is all you care about, okay, yes, the 440A makes sense. If you're doing field recording and you really need to watch out for 60 hertz or you need to watch out for hiss, yeah, the 840A is definitely the better out of the two. And sure, you might be somebody who really likes a V-shaped sound signature, and this isn't a bad headphone with a V-shaped sound signature. But it's also not a great headphone either. Between the two, yes, I do prefer the 840A, and at times it did sound good, but neither of these headphones is getting a recommendation from me, and instead I would turn your attention towards AKG's offerings. And that is going to wrap up this video. Guys, if you liked it, please leave a like down below, a comment letting me know what you want to see in the future. If you want to get active in the community, you can at the forum linked in the video description. As always, don't forget to stick around and subscribe for more videos like this. Till the next one. Peace.